This is True Crime Stories for Sleep. December 11th, 1974, began as an ordinary winter morning in La Palma, a small city in Orange County, California. Yet, by the end of that day, the quiet apartment building at 4882 La Palma Avenue would become the scene of a violent crime that would remain unsolved for decades. Patricia, Annie Ross, a 31-year-old resident known to friends for her vibrant personality and small circle of close neighbors, had been brutally murdered. Her apartment bore the signs of a struggle: overturned furniture, scattered belongings, and the horrifying discovery that she had been strangled. Law enforcement responded promptly, yet despite thorough investigative work at the time, the case would go cold, frustrating detectives and leaving the community with unanswered questions for years to come. Before we continue, if you're captivated by cold cases solved through extraordinary circumstances, make sure to subscribe, like, and comment where you're reading from. Sharing your interest helps bring more true stories told in documentary detail, stories of human perseverance, forensic innovation, and unexpected heroes. Now let's return to the morning of December 11, 1974, when a seemingly ordinary apartment would become the epicenter of a decades-long mystery, one that would later involve an unexpected witness, Annie's small dog, Jody. Detectives arriving at the scene quickly realized that Annie Ross's disappearance and subsequent murder were not routine. The apartment had no signs of forced entry, suggesting that the perpetrator either had a key or was someone the victim knew and trusted. Her neighbors recalled seeing Annie leave the previous evening, and her absence the following day prompted immediate concern. Officers began canvassing the neighborhood, collecting witness statements, and documenting every detail of the apartment, from the position of overturned chairs to the open drawers in the bedroom. Each observation would later prove essential to reconstructing the sequence of events. One of the most striking elements of the scene was the presence of Annie's dog, Jody, a small, energetic companion who had been confined in a dresser drawer by the perpetrator. Investigators noted the dog's distress and protective behavior as they examined the apartment. While the dog's small stature might have seemed insignificant, her presence would later prove crucial. At the time, officers documented Jody's behavior, her physical condition, and the fact that she bore minor injuries, likely inflicted in the struggle or as the perpetrator attempted to control her. This level of attention to even minor witnesses reflected a meticulous approach to evidence that would lay the groundwork for future breakthroughs. Forensic investigators in 1974 were limited by the technology of the era. DNA profiling did not exist, and analysis relied heavily on fingerprinting, blood typing, and meticulous documentation of the crime scene. Officers collected trace evidence, including hair fibers, blood stains, and impressions left on furniture and walls. Every scrap of material could potentially connect a suspect to the crime, but at the time, these leads produced no actionable matches. Despite their best efforts, the case remained unresolved, with investigators eventually categorizing it as a cold case when traditional leads failed to produce suspects. Community response to Annie Ross's murder was a mixture of shock and sorrow. Residents in La Palma and neighboring areas expressed concern about the randomness of the crime and the apparent absence of motive. Local newspapers reported extensively on the incident, detailing the scene, the investigation, and the limitations that law enforcement faced in the 1970s. While initial coverage raised public awareness, it also contributed to a perception of unsolved peril, leaving lingering anxiety among those who knew Annie or lived in similar apartment complexes. In the years that followed, police revisited the evidence periodically, a common practice with cold cases. Files were updated, new investigative techniques were considered, and detectives occasionally reopened interviews with neighbors and acquaintances. These routine reviews ensured that the case remained on record and allowed new developments in forensic science to be considered. Importantly, items collected from the scene, including hair samples, blood-stained objects, and photographs, were preserved carefully, enabling their re-examination when technology advanced. Among these preserved items was a detail initially considered minor: the interaction between Annie's dog and the crime scene. At the time, investigators documented the dog's location, injuries, and traces left at the scene, but the significance of these details would only become apparent decades later. Over time, advances in forensic science began to provide new opportunities. DNA analysis, which became widely available in the late 1980s and early 1990s, offered a revolutionary method for examining biological evidence. However, due to the small scale of samples and the degradation of materials over decades, many cold cases remained resistant to resolution. The Annie Ross case was no exception. While evidence from the scene was preserved, it was not immediately suitable for early DNA profiling. This limitation reinforced the importance of patience and meticulous documentation. Every observation made in 1974 would serve as a reference point when new scientific methods could finally be applied. In addition to scientific limitations, investigators faced procedural and societal challenges. Witnesses' memories faded over time, original detectives retired or moved on, and records occasionally became incomplete or difficult to access. The combination of these factors meant that cold case files required continuous maintenance and contextual knowledge to remain viable. Police departments recognized that without careful preservation and documentation, decades-old evidence could lose its utility. In the case of Annie Ross, the diligence of those early investigators would ultimately prove crucial, preserving details that modern investigators could later exploit. It was not until the 2010s that renewed attention to the case brought it back into the spotlight. Detectives recognized that Annie's small dog, Jody, who had been confined in the dresser and bore evidence of the struggle, represented more than an incidental witness. With modern forensic techniques and a growing understanding of animal-assisted crime scene evidence, investigators revisited the details of Jody's injuries and traces. Analysts realized that the dog may have bitten or scratched the perpetrator during the attack, preserving microscopic biological evidence. This connection provided the critical breakthrough necessary to finally identify the individual responsible for Annie's death. The reopening of the case also reflected a broader trend in cold case investigations: the integration of canine behavior analysis with forensic science. While dogs cannot testify in court, their interactions with victims, perpetrators, or evidence can leave tangible traces, such as saliva, skin cells, or hair. Recognizing the potential significance of these traces was a turning point in the investigation of Annie Ross's murder. It exemplified how meticulous observation and an understanding of animal behavior could complement traditional investigative techniques, offering a new avenue to resolve crimes previously considered unsolvable. The renewed investigation, guided by modern forensic specialists and inspired by the preserved evidence from the 1970s, ultimately focused on obtaining DNA profiles from material associated with the dog and the scene. The painstaking analysis of Jody's scratches and bites, combined with biological evidence recovered from furniture and other preserved items, eventually allowed investigators to match DNA to Larry Stevens, a man with a criminal history who had previously evaded suspicion. This breakthrough demonstrated that even decades-old evidence could yield definitive results when examined with contemporary scientific methods. By December 2015, law enforcement had assembled a compelling case. Stevens was arrested and charged with the 1974 murder of Annie Ross, nearly 41 years after the crime occurred. The arrest highlighted the convergence of meticulous 1970s investigative work, careful preservation of evidence, and modern forensic innovation, demonstrating that no detail is truly insignificant in the pursuit of justice. The case also underscored the unique role that Annie's small dog played in preserving evidence critical to identifying the perpetrator. The story of Annie Ross and her dog, Jody, serves as a powerful example of how persistence, careful documentation, and innovative thinking can transform a cold case into a solvable mystery. While at the time of her death, the dog's involvement seemed inconsequential, the integration of modern forensic science revealed the latent significance of these small but crucial details. Investigators' foresight in preserving evidence ensured that when technology caught up, the case could finally be brought to resolution. The apartment where Patricia, Annie, Ross lived in La Palma, California, in 1974 was unremarkable from the outside, a modest unit in a low-rise complex, flanked by similar buildings and a small parking lot. Yet within its walls, the The scene discovered by law enforcement in December revealed a harrowing story of violence and intrusion. When officers arrived after concerned neighbors reported her absence, they were confronted with the unsettling reality of a homicide: furniture overturned, personal belongings scattered, and the unmistakable signs of a struggle. Every detail of that scene would later prove critical to reconstructing the final moments of Annie's life. The living room, the first space detectives examined, bore evidence of chaos. Chairs were tipped over, and a coffee table lay askew, its contents, a mix of magazines, a small lamp, and loose coins, strewn across the carpet. Investigators noted the absence of forced entry at the front door, an anomaly that suggested Annie either knew the perpetrator or had inadvertently allowed access. A careful sweep of fingerprints and other trace evidence in this area revealed nothing immediately conclusive, yet the arrangement of displaced objects suggested resistance. The perpetrator appeared to have been moving quickly but not recklessly, aiming to reach a specific target rather than looting indiscriminately. The kitchen provided additional context. Cabinet doors were closed, drawers intact, and small personal items undisturbed. Cash kept in a kitchen drawer remained untouched. This suggested that the motive was not burglary in the conventional sense. Rather, investigators concluded that the attack may have been personal or opportunistic, targeting Annie herself. These observations would later align with evidence collected from the bedroom, forming a timeline of intrusion, confrontation, and assault that forensic analysts reconstructed decades later. Central to the investigation was the bedroom, where the most direct evidence of the struggle was concentrated. Annie's bed was disheveled, blankets torn, and sheets showing stains that would later be identified as small traces of the attacker's blood. In the corner, Annie's dog, Jody, was confined in a dresser drawer, a detail that initially seemed minor but would later prove pivotal. Investigators carefully noted the dog's location, her visible agitation, and the minor injuries she had sustained, scratches on her paws and muzzle likely inflicted during the struggle. While these injuries did not appear life-threatening to the dog, they provided investigators with evidence of resistance. Jody had interacted with the perpetrator, leaving physical traces that could be analyzed years later. The physical evidence was complemented by forensic photography, a critical tool in the 1970s for preserving the scene. Every angle of the apartment, from floor to ceiling, was documented to capture the positions of objects, the placement of bloodstains, and even minor scuffs on walls and door frames. Investigators understood that without modern digital imaging, detailed photographic records were the closest approximation to preserving a crime scene for future analysis. These images, alongside written observations and sketches, would form the backbone of the case file maintained for decades. Clues extended to smaller details. Jewelry and personal effects were scattered but mostly untouched, suggesting that the attack was not motivated by theft of possessions. This reinforced the idea that the crime was primarily focused on the victim. Investigators also noted the pattern of blood and hair on furniture, the floor, and the walls. While contemporary tools could not identify DNA, blood typing allowed forensic experts to differentiate between the victim's blood and potential biological material from another individual. These early observations would later provide critical points of comparison when DNA technology became available. The apartment's layout also offered insight into the perpetrator's movements. The living room provided initial access. The kitchen and hallway acted as transitional spaces, guiding the intruder toward the bedroom. The dog's placement in the drawer indicated that the perpetrator attempted to control potential interference. Investigators speculated that the intruder may have anticipated Jody's defensive behavior and sought to neutralize it. This assumption, while initially speculative, would gain credibility decades later when DNA evidence confirmed the dog's interaction with the attacker. Witnesses contributed another layer of reconstruction. Neighbors reported hearing sounds of struggle late in the evening, though at the time these observations were vague and could not be precisely correlated to the timeline of the attack. Investigators documented these accounts carefully, recognizing their potential value in cross-referencing other evidence. Statements regarding comings and goings near the apartment, unusual noises, or the sighting of unfamiliar individuals were all recorded. While these reports did not immediately yield actionable leads, they would later provide context when re-examining the case with modern techniques. Forensic evidence from the scene included hair samples, traces of blood on furniture, and minute fibers that would later be examined using DNA technology. Investigators collected swabs from areas the perpetrator was likely to have touched, including door handles, drawer fronts, and the edges of furniture. In 1974, these samples could be analyzed only for blood typing, not DNA, leaving investigators with limited ability to directly identify a suspect. Nevertheless, the meticulous collection ensured that the evidence was preserved in a manner suitable for future analysis, a foresight that would ultimately prove decisive. Another unusual aspect of the scene was the apparent lack of forced removal of items. The cash in drawers, personal documents, and other valuables remained largely untouched. This suggested a crime focused on the victim rather than material gain. Investigators hypothesized that the perpetrator either acted out of personal animosity or opportunistic predation, aiming to attack Annie herself. Over time, this assessment would be reinforced by behavioral profiling, particularly after the case was reopened decades later. The dresser drawer where Jody was confined became a focal point of both initial and later investigation. Its positioning, the scratches on its surfaces, and the minor blood traces on its edges indicated that the dog had struggled and interacted with the perpetrator. While overlooked initially, these details preserved a biological record of the attacker, providing an unexpected bridge between a decades-old crime and modern DNA analysis. Forensic scientists, when examining the evidence years later, were able to extract DNA from these interactions, demonstrating how even small, seemingly inconsequential details can carry enormous evidentiary weight. The combination of physical evidence, witness statements, and detailed photographic documentation ensured that the apartment itself functioned as a preserved record of the crime. When investigators revisited the case decades later, this careful attention to detail allowed them to reconstruct the sequence of events with remarkable precision. The trajectory from entrance to living room to bedroom, the displacement of objects, and the interaction between the dog and the perpetrator could all be correlated, demonstrating the foresight and professionalism of the original 1974 investigation. In retrospect, the apartment's crime scene exemplifies the interplay of chaos and order in violent incidents. While the scene appeared disordered at first glance, careful analysis revealed patterns in movement, restraint, and focus. The perpetrator's actions were deliberate, not random, and the preservation of evidence allowed future investigators to uncover these patterns. The dog, Jody, while small and overlooked, emerged as a silent witness, preserving traces of the attack that human investigators alone could not capture. By the end of the initial investigation, law enforcement had created a comprehensive record of the scene. Photographs, sketches, witness statements, and collected physical evidence were organized and preserved, forming a foundation for the case file. Though immediate leads proved inconclusive, the meticulous documentation would ultimately allow modern forensic science to revisit the evidence with new eyes. In particular, the dog's interactions, initially recorded as minor injuries and behavioral notes, would later become central to connecting the perpetrator to the crime, demonstrating the lasting value of thorough crime scene investigation. Following the initial examination of Patricia, Annie, Ross's apartment in La Palma, California, law enforcement faced an array of challenges that would ultimately cause the investigation to stall. In December 1974, forensic science was limited, and while detectives meticulously documented the scene and collected evidence, technology and procedural limitations prevented immediate resolution. The investigation, initially promising due to the preserved crime scene and the dog's presence, gradually encountered dead ends that would keep the case cold for decades. Detectives began by attempting to establish a timeline of Annie's final hours. Witness interviews provided fragmented and sometimes contradictory accounts. Neighbors reported hearing noises late at night, described as scuffles or falling objects, but these accounts lacked precise timing. Others recalled seeing an unfamiliar figure near the apartment complex, but poor lighting and the brevity of observations limited their utility. Investigators compiled statements and attempted to correlate them with known habits of the victim, including her work schedule, social engagements, and routine interactions with neighbors. Yet no pattern emerged that could identify a suspect. Physical evidence offered promise but had inherent limitations. Blood stains on furniture and surfaces were collected and typed to the victim, but without the ability to analyze DNA, investigators could not link these stains to a perpetrator. Hair samples found at the scene were similarly inconclusive. While some hairs were not consistent with Annie's own, forensic methods of the era, primarily microscopic comparison, were insufficient to establish identity. The small, preserved details that would later prove crucial, such as Jody's scratches and saliva traces, could not yet be meaningfully interpreted, leaving investigators with clues that were tantalizing but ultimately unusable. The apparent absence of forced entry complicated the search for suspects. Detectives considered both acquaintances and strangers, weighing possibilities from personal vendettas to opportunistic crime. However, without clear evidence of prior interaction or motive, suspicion could not be definitively placed. The lack of eyewitness confirmation of the intruder's identity compounded this difficulty. Police distributed photographs and circulated descriptions based on what little surveillance or neighbor observations existed, but the vague nature of these sketches made them ineffective in generating leads. The role of Annie's dog, Jody, while noted in initial reports, was not fully appreciated in 1974. Officers documented her injuries and behavior but lacked the forensic tools to analyze the biological traces the dog had inadvertently preserved. Minor scratches, saliva deposits, and disturbances in the apartment were catalogued, yet no immediate connection could be drawn to a suspect. In effect, the dog's presence represented evidence whose significance would remain latent until advances in forensic science decades later. At the time, it was simply a curious footnote in an otherwise perplexing investigation. Detectives also pursued potential motives based on Annie's social and professional life. She had a small circle of friends and was not publicly involved in conflicts that might provoke violence. Her apartment was tidy, and valuables were left undisturbed, indicating the crime was personal rather than opportunistic theft. Investigators reviewed acquaintances and former romantic partners, searching for someone with the motive and opportunity to commit such a crime. Leads emerged intermittently but often fizzled when corroborating evidence could not be found. The procedural limitations of the time made it impossible to explore every avenue thoroughly. Investigative techniques in 1974 relied heavily on traditional methods such as interviews, neighborhood canvassing, and crime scene reconstruction. Fingerprinting was a cornerstone of the process, and while officers collected prints from various surfaces, none could be conclusively matched to a suspect. Police records were consulted to identify individuals with prior offenses in the area, but no connections emerged. Even routine checks of employment, known associates, and criminal history yielded no leads, leaving investigators increasingly reliant on circumstantial evidence and speculation. As weeks turned into months, the case began to cool. Detectives revisited evidence and re-interviewed witnesses periodically, but the lack of breakthrough evidence stalled progress. Investigators compiled extensive files, including photographs, sketches, and laboratory notes, preserving everything meticulously. These records ensured that when forensic technology advanced, the original observations could be leveraged. The careful preservation of minor details, such as the dog's interactions, furniture displacements, and subtle traces of biological material, was crucial, even if their immediate utility was limited. Media coverage at the time reflected both public interest and frustration. Newspapers reported on the discovery, detailing the crime scene and investigative efforts, but without suspects, stories focused on the mystery rather than resolution. The community remained vigilant but anxious, with residents fearful of a violent stranger or of a perpetrator living nearby. The case attracted sporadic attention from amateur sleuths and concerned citizens, but their efforts were largely limited by the lack of concrete evidence and the inability to analyze biological traces in a meaningful way. One significant challenge was the interpretation of what little evidence existed regarding the dog. While Jody's injuries and behavior were documented, law enforcement in 1974 could not quantify or analyze animal-assisted traces. The scratches, minor blood traces, and saliva marks could not be effectively connected to a suspect using contemporary technology. For decades, these details remained peripheral, hinting at potential but offering no actionable path forward. It was only later, with advances in DNA testing and forensic methodology, that the latent value of this evidence would be realized. Another obstacle was the passage of time itself. As months and years passed, memories faded, and potential witnesses moved, died, or became unavailable. Neighborhood dynamics changed, and records deteriorated or became harder to access. Investigators recognized that cold cases were at risk of permanent stagnation without continuous preservation and periodic review. The Annie Ross case exemplified these challenges, illustrating how a well-documented crime scene and meticulous evidence handling could preserve a path to eventual resolution, even if decades elapsed before that path could be followed. During the cold case period, law enforcement occasionally revisited the apartment and evidence. Technicians tested new methods of crime scene documentation, examined stored samples for emerging forensic techniques, and compared Annie's case to other unsolved crimes. While these efforts yielded no immediate arrests, they ensured that the evidence was maintained in a condition suitable for future technological applications. Importantly, the presence of Jodi and the traces she left would later enable the application of DNA analysis, linking the perpetrator to the crime in a manner impossible at the time of the murder. By the late 20th century, the Annie Ross case had become emblematic of cold case challenges. A violent crime with substantial documentation but insufficient actionable leads. The preserved evidence, however, offered hope. Detectives recognized that once DNA analysis became viable and forensic techniques advanced, previously indecipherable clues, hair, saliva, blood traces, and animal interactions, could be re-evaluated. The case demonstrated the long-term value of meticulous record-keeping, careful evidence collection, and awareness that even minor elements, such as a dog's defensive scratches, could prove central to eventual resolution. The investigation stall was not due to negligence or oversight. Officers at the time employed every available method: canvassing, interviews, fingerprints, hair analysis, and blood typing. Yet, the limitations of the era rendered these methods insufficient to generate conclusive leads. The preservation of evidence, foresight in documentation, and attention to detail by law enforcement in 1974 created the foundation that would ultimately allow the case to be solved decades later, highlighting the interplay between human diligence and technological advancement. Even as the investigation remained cold, lessons were embedded in the records. The apartment's preserved crime scene, the photographs, and the detailed observations of Annie's dog maintained the integrity of the original investigation. When modern investigators later revisited the case, they were able to reconstruct the events of December 11, 1974, with remarkable precision, allowing previously dormant evidence to finally fulfill its purpose. In retrospect, the stagnation of the investigation was less a failure and more a testament to the limitations of the era, underscoring how time and innovation can transform unsolvable cases into solvable ones. By the early 2010s, advances in forensic science had transformed the landscape of cold case investigations. DNA technology had matured, forensic laboratories had developed sophisticated analytical techniques, and law enforcement agencies increasingly revisited unresolved crimes. Among these was the murder of Patricia, Annie Ross, a case that had remained cold for nearly 4 decades. Though originally investigated with diligence and attention to detail, the constraints of the 1970s had prevented the identification of a perpetrator. Renewed interest in cold cases, coupled with technological breakthroughs, provided a pathway to finally examine the evidence with modern tools. Detectives assigned to the reopened investigation began with a comprehensive review of the original case files. Photographs, sketches, witness statements, and preserved evidence were scrutinized for new insights. Of particular interest was the documentation of Annie's dog, Jodi, who had been confined in a dresser drawer and bore minor injuries from the struggle. At the time of the original investigation, these details were recorded but not fully understood. Modern investigators recognized that the dog might have played a pivotal role in preserving biological traces from the perpetrator. This realization marked a turning point in approaching the decades-old case. The first step in reopening the case involved cataloging all preserved physical evidence. Hair samples, blood-stained furniture, and other trace materials had been meticulously stored in climate-controlled conditions by the Orange County Police Department. This foresight allowed forensic analysts to apply contemporary DNA extraction techniques to decades-old samples, a process previously considered impossible due to degradation. Laboratory teams assessed which materials were suitable for testing and prioritized items most likely to contain evidence of the attacker, including swabs taken from surfaces the perpetrator was likely to touch and biological material associated with the dog's defensive injuries. Parallel to the laboratory efforts, detectives re-interviewed surviving witnesses. Neighbors who had provided statements in 1974 were contacted to clarify their recollections and provide additional context. Even decades later, some details, such as the time they heard noises, the sighting of unfamiliar individuals, or unusual activity around the apartment, helped establish the sequence of events. While memories were naturally affected by the passage of time, these interviews offered complementary information to the forensic evidence, providing a broader picture of the circumstances surrounding Annie's murder. Investigators also re-examined the original crime scene photographs and sketches. Advances in digital imaging and enhancement allowed subtle details to be analyzed more accurately than was possible in the 1970s. Forensic specialists could measure angles, distances, and spatial relationships within the apartment with precision. These analyses helped reconstruct the perpetrator's movements during the attack and offered insights into how the dog, Jody, interacted with the intruder. Minor scratches, disrupted furniture, and trace evidence locations were evaluated with renewed focus, illustrating the degree to which careful original documentation had preserved vital information for future analysis. A key development in reopening the case was recognizing the dog's role in preserving evidence. Analysts hypothesized that during the struggle, Jody had bitten or scratched the perpetrator, leaving saliva, skin cells, or blood traces behind. While these traces had been recorded in 1974, the significance was not yet appreciated, and the technology to analyze them did not exist. With modern forensic DNA profiling, scientists could extract genetic material from previously unexaminable samples. This provided the critical opportunity to identify the perpetrator definitively, linking biological evidence preserved by the dog to an individual decades later. Detectives also explored the broader context of the crime to reassess potential suspects. In 1974, the investigation had focused on acquaintances, former romantic partners, and individuals with criminal records in the area. With the passage of time, law enforcement had access to databases that allowed broader background checks, linking historical criminal activity, prior offenses, and residence patterns. The integration of DNA analysis with investigative databases expanded the ability to cross-reference potential suspects with biological evidence collected from the scene. Laboratory work began with small-scale DNA extraction from preserved samples associated with the dog. Analysts carefully processed saliva, blood traces, and hair samples, taking extraordinary care to prevent contamination. Initial results indicated the presence of DNA not belonging to Annie Ross, suggesting the successful recovery of material from a second individual. This breakthrough marked the first tangible lead in decades and demonstrated the value of preserving evidence and revisiting cold cases with modern technology. Simultaneously, detectives employed genealogical and database comparisons to narrow the pool of potential suspects. By integrating DNA findings with public and law enforcement records, investigators could identify individuals with matches to the extracted profiles. This process, unthinkable in 1974, leveraged contemporary scientific and technological tools to compensate for investigative limitations of the past. The methodical application of these techniques ultimately pointed toward one individual whose DNA profile was consistent with biological material recovered at the scene. While DNA provided a powerful lead, investigators were careful to corroborate findings with other evidence. Original witness statements, photographs, and crime scene reconstructions were compared against the suspect's known whereabouts and history. This comprehensive approach ensured that the case was built on multiple converging lines of evidence, increasing confidence in the conclusions drawn. The integration of modern science with careful historical record-keeping exemplified the meticulous process required to resolve long-standing cold cases. Throughout the process, the significance of the dog's presence remained central. Jody's defensive actions had inadvertently preserved evidence that would have been otherwise unattainable. The realization that a small animal could serve as a repository of crucial biological material transformed the investigative approach. Specialists recognized that even minor, initially overlooked details could carry the weight of pivotal evidence decades later, emphasizing the importance of thorough documentation and preservation in all stages of crime investigation. Detectives also reviewed the investigative techniques employed in similar cold cases. Comparisons were made with instances where biological evidence from animals, clothing, or personal items had enabled identification of suspects long after the crime. These comparative analyses informed procedural decisions, including which samples to prioritize, which analytical methods to employ, and how to interpret results in the context of historical evidence. Lessons drawn from other cases reinforced the innovative nature of combining canine-assisted evidence with modern DNA analysis. By the conclusion of the reopening phase, law enforcement had established a clear investigative pathway. The preserved evidence had been re-examined using cutting-edge DNA techniques, witness statements had been updated and clarified, and crime scene reconstructions had been enhanced using digital tools. All elements converged to create a coherent narrative. Annie Ross had been attacked in her apartment, her small dog had resisted the intruder, and biological material preserved during that interaction could now be traced to an individual with a direct connection to the crime. The reopening of the case underscored several broader lessons in criminal investigation. It illustrated the critical importance of evidence preservation, demonstrating that meticulous record-keeping and sample storage can enable breakthroughs long after the initial investigation. It highlighted the role of innovative forensic science, particularly DNA analysis, in solving cases previously considered unsolvable. And it revealed how seemingly minor elements, such as a dog's defensive behavior, can carry critical evidentiary weight, bridging the gap between historical crime scene documentation and modern scientific capabilities. Ultimately, the reopening of the Annie Ross case in the 2010s transformed a decades-long investigation from a dormant file into an active, evidence-driven pursuit. By integrating preserved evidence, modern DNA profiling, historical witness accounts, and crime scene reconstructions, law enforcement set the stage for the eventual identification and apprehension of the perpetrator. The combination of human diligence, technological advancement, and the inadvertent assistance of a small dog would redefine the boundaries of what was possible in cold case resolution, demonstrating that no detail is too small and no lead too trivial when seeking justice. In the decades following the murder of Patricia, Annie Ross, her small dog, Jody, was largely considered a minor element of the crime scene. At the time, detectives had noted her presence, the injuries she bore, and her agitated behavior in the apartment, but these details were catalogued without a full understanding of their potential evidentiary value. Jody, a petite canine companion confined in a dresser drawer during the attack, had resisted the intruder with the instinctive bravery characteristic of her species. While investigators in 1974 lacked the forensic tools to analyze her interactions, modern science would later reveal that the dog had preserved critical biological evidence, bridging a 40-year investigative gap. The process began when the cold case was reopened in the 2010s. Detectives and forensic analysts revisited all preserved evidence, including swabs taken from furniture, flooring, and surfaces within the apartment. Special attention was given to the dresser drawer where Jody had been confined. During the struggle, investigators hypothesized the dog likely came into direct contact with the assailant, biting, scratching, or otherwise marking the perpetrator with saliva, skin cells, or fur fragments. These interactions had left traces that, while invisible to investigators at the time, could now be extracted and analyzed using contemporary DNA techniques. The dog's role was not merely incidental. Behavioral experts noted that Jody's defensive actions, though constrained by the small space of the dresser, were consistent with an attempt to protect her owner. When an animal is confined or threatened, instinct dictates aggressive resistance. For Jody, This meant attempting to bite the intruder or scratch at clothing and exposed skin. Analysts theorized that these actions would inadvertently deposit the assailant's DNA onto the dog's teeth, claws, or fur, creating an unintentional but highly valuable biological record. This concept, recognizing animals as potential vectors of evidence, was relatively novel but proved essential in the Ross case. Laboratory work focused on isolating DNA from Jody's preserved samples. Technicians employed extraction methods suitable for degraded or decades-old material, recognizing that biological evidence can deteriorate over time, particularly when stored under non-ideal conditions. Hair, saliva residue, and minute blood traces collected from the dog's mouth, paws, and coat were meticulously processed. Despite the age of the samples, sufficient genetic material was recovered, enabling analysts to generate a DNA profile consistent with that of a single human individual who had been in direct contact with the dog during the struggle. The implications were profound. While conventional evidence, blood, fingerprints, and hair samples from the apartment, had failed to identify a perpetrator, the dog's preserved interactions had created a unique avenue for forensic breakthrough. Jody had inadvertently acted as a living repository of biological evidence, capturing traces of the assailant's presence in a way that no other element of the crime scene could. This connection highlighted the unrecognized role animals can play in criminal investigations, particularly when human interactions are insufficient to establish a suspect's identity. Detectives then integrated the canine evidence with other preserved materials. Swabs from furniture, flooring, and walls were analyzed to corroborate DNA recovered from the dog. The combined results strengthened the profile, confirming that the DNA from Jody's interactions matched the same individual as material found elsewhere in the apartment. This convergence provided compelling evidence that the perpetrator had indeed interacted with both the dog and the environment, reinforcing the forensic narrative constructed from historical documentation and contemporary analysis. Beyond laboratory analysis, the canine connection was examined through the lens of behavioral profiling. Experts in animal behavior contributed insight into the dog's likely movements during the struggle. They considered factors such as confined space, the positioning of furniture, and the physical capacity of Jody to engage with an adult human assailant. These assessments helped reconstruct the sequence of events, suggesting that the perpetrator's attempts to subdue the dog were likely brief but sufficient to transfer DNA material. The integration of behavior science with forensic analysis exemplified the interdisciplinary approach that modern investigators increasingly employ in cold case resolution. The rediscovery of the dog's evidentiary role also highlighted the foresight of the original 1974 investigators. Although they could not utilize canine-assisted evidence at the time, their careful documentation of the dog's location, condition, and interactions provided a foundation for later breakthroughs. Photos, written observations, and physical preservation of the animal's environment enabled forensic analysts decades later to make connections that would have been impossible without meticulous record-keeping. In effect, Jody's defensive actions and the early attention paid by investigators converged to create a unique opportunity for resolution. This canine-assisted approach was consistent with emerging trends in cold case methodology. Across the United States, law enforcement agencies increasingly recognized that animals could inadvertently preserve evidence through hair, saliva, scratches, or other biological traces. Training programs began emphasizing careful documentation of pets and animal interactions at crime scenes, reflecting the lessons learned from high-profile cases such as Ross's. The use of canine evidence in this context represents a shift in understanding, acknowledging that even small animals can serve as critical witnesses, capturing details that human observation alone might miss. While Jody's role was exceptional, it was complemented by other preserved evidence. Items such as the bed linens, small bloodstains on furniture, and personal belongings continued to be analyzed in tandem with canine-derived DNA. The integration of these multiple evidence streams created a comprehensive profile of the perpetrator, linking biological material across different surfaces and confirming the narrative of the attack. This methodological rigor ensured that the dog's contribution was not isolated but rather part of a cohesive forensic reconstruction. The laboratory results prompted law enforcement to revisit potential suspects from both historical and contemporary databases. By correlating DNA extracted from Jody with available profiles, investigators narrowed the focus to individuals with prior criminal history or connections to the area. This narrowed focus, combined with circumstantial evidence and contemporary techniques such as genealogical analysis and database matching, ultimately identified Larry Stevens as the individual whose DNA matched material preserved from the 1974 crime scene. The dog's interaction had provided the critical link necessary for this identification. Importantly, the case demonstrated that canine evidence could achieve probative value in court. DNA recovered from the dog was admissible, provided that chain of custody protocols were rigorously maintained and contamination minimized. Forensic testimony explained how Jody's defensive behavior had preserved biological material and how laboratory analysis extracted a reliable profile from decades-old samples. This validation emphasized that animals at crime scenes are not merely passive observers. Under the right circumstances, they can become active participants in the collection of crucial evidence. As investigators pieced together the events of December 11, 1974, Jody's contribution became central to the narrative of the crime. By examining the location of the dog, her injuries, and the preserved biological traces, analysts reconstructed a detailed account of the assailant's movements and interactions. The integration of behavioral science, forensic DNA analysis, and meticulous historical documentation allowed detectives to bridge a 40-year gap, turning what was once considered trivial into decisive evidence. In conclusion, the canine connection in the Annie Ross case illustrates the extraordinary role that a small, defensively minded dog can play in criminal investigations. Jody, confined and threatened, preserved traces of the perpetrator in ways that human investigators could not. Decades later, her inadvertent contribution provided the pivotal evidence required to identify the killer, demonstrating that careful observation, preservation of minor details, and interdisciplinary forensic approaches can transform the outcome of long-dormant investigations. The combination of animal behavior, modern DNA profiling, and historical evidence ultimately redefined the boundaries of what is possible in cold case resolution. Decades after the tragic death of Patricia, Annie Ross in La Palma, California, forensic science had advanced to a point that made the resolution of her cold case not only possible but inevitable. What had been an investigation constrained by 1970s limitations was transformed by technological innovations, particularly in DNA analysis and the interpretation of trace evidence. While the initial investigation had been meticulous, it relied heavily on observational skills, basic blood typing, fingerprinting, and hair analysis. By the 2010s, these methods could be augmented and, in some cases, superseded, providing unprecedented clarity and precision in connecting the perpetrator to the crime scene. The first major breakthrough came with the re-examination of biological evidence preserved from Annie Ross's apartment. Items previously collected, including swabs from the dresser drawer where her dog Jody had been confined, bedding, and minor blood traces on furniture, were processed using advanced DNA extraction techniques. Forensic analysts employed polymerase chain reaction, PCR, methods optimized for degraded samples, capable of amplifying minute quantities of genetic material from decades-old evidence. This technique, unavailable in 1974, allowed scientists to isolate a DNA profile from the perpetrator, a critical development that would have been inconceivable in the original investigation. The preserved dog, Jody, emerged as a central focus in the laboratory analysis. Technicians examined saliva residues on the dog's teeth and scratches on her paws, which likely contacted the attacker during the struggle. Using specialized extraction methods, they retrieved cells containing the perpetrator's DNA. These cells, despite being exposed to nearly 40 years of potential degradation, were sufficient to generate a reliable genetic profile. The laboratory process required rigorous contamination control and cross-verification, given the historical age of the samples and the potential for environmental exposure over the decades. Concurrently, analysts revisited hair and fiber samples collected from the apartment. Microscopic comparison in 1974 had been largely inconclusive, but modern mitochondrial DNA analysis allowed the extraction of maternal lineage information from hair shafts lacking roots. This additional genetic data provided further confirmation of the primary DNA profile obtained from the dog. When combined with PCR-amplified samples from the apartment, forensic specialists could assert with high confidence that all biological traces were linked to a single individual, providing a consistent narrative of the perpetrator's presence at the crime scene. Bloodstains, previously typed only to the ABO system, were reanalyzed using contemporary DNA sequencing. This process allowed for precise identification of the perpetrator and facilitated comparison with law enforcement databases. The integration of multiple lines of evidence, saliva, hair, blood, and trace skin cells, demonstrated the comprehensive nature of the forensic breakthrough. It was the convergence of these independent samples that transformed a decades-old unsolved case into a solvable investigation, illustrating the cumulative power of multiple forensic disciplines working in concert. The laboratory breakthroughs were complemented by digital reconstruction techniques. Crime scene photographs taken in 1974 were scanned and enhanced using modern imaging software. Investigators created three-dimensional reconstructions of Annie Ross's apartment, mapping the locations of displaced furniture, biological traces, and the position of the dog. By modeling the spatial relationships between the perpetrator, the victim, and the dog, analysts could infer the sequence of events, including the struggle and interactions that led to the transfer of biological material. These reconstructions added context to the DNA findings, strengthening the evidentiary narrative and providing visual confirmation of the sequence of events. One of the most significant aspects of the forensic breakthrough was the role of the dog as an unintentional witness. While traditional evidence, blood, fingerprints, and hair, had failed to yield a suspect for decades, the dog's defensive actions preserved DNA that was both unique and actionable. This realization marked a turning point in the investigation. Jody's interaction with the perpetrator had captured critical biological evidence that would not have been deposited elsewhere, highlighting the importance of considering all potential vectors in forensic analysis, including animals present at a crime scene. With a viable DNA profile in hand, investigators were able to query state and federal databases. At the time of the original crime, no match could have been made, but by the 2010s, comprehensive DNA repositories contained profiles from millions of individuals. The genetic information recovered from Jody and other crime scene samples produced a match to Larry Stevens, an individual with a prior criminal record and connections to the area during the time of the crime. The identification was corroborated by multiple evidence streams, including biological material from the dog, furniture, and other preserved samples. In addition to DNA, analysts examined touch DNA from surfaces that the perpetrator had likely contacted during the struggle. These included door handles, drawer edges, and the dresser itself. The successful extraction of DNA from these items further reinforced the link between Stevens and the crime. Touch DNA, while often difficult to recover from decades-old surfaces, was preserved due to the careful storage conditions maintained by the original investigators. The combination of touch DNA and canine-assisted biological evidence created an irrefutable connection between the perpetrator and the crime scene. The integration of forensic breakthroughs also extended to behavioral analysis. Experts considered the sequence of events, reconstructing the perpetrator's actions based on the location of biological traces, the dog's defensive behavior, and the arrangement of objects in the apartment. This reconstruction confirmed that the attacker had interacted with both Annie Ross and Jody in predictable ways, consistent with a struggle within the confined space of the apartment. Behavioral analysis supported the forensic findings, offering a narrative that explained the distribution of DNA and other evidence throughout the scene. Laboratory validation played a critical role in ensuring the admissibility of evidence. Every step of DNA extraction, amplification, and comparison was documented, peer-reviewed, and cross-checked to prevent error. Analysts ran controls to verify that no contamination occurred and confirmed that the DNA profiles recovered from different sources were consistent and reproducible. This methodological rigor ensured that the evidence derived from canine-assisted interaction, touch DNA, and preserved bloodstains met the standards necessary for legal proceedings. The combination of DNA technology, digital reconstruction, and behavioral analysis represented a paradigm shift in cold case investigation. What had been a decades-long stalemate transformed into an evidence-driven narrative linking the perpetrator directly to the crime scene. The forensic breakthroughs achieved in the Ross case exemplified the evolution of investigative science, demonstrating that with careful preservation, innovative techniques, and interdisciplinary analysis, even crimes committed nearly half a century ago could be resolved. Ultimately, the forensic breakthroughs in the Annie Ross case underscored the enduring importance of meticulous evidence collection, forward-thinking preservation, and the integration of emerging technologies. The unique contribution of the dog, Jody, coupled with modern DNA analysis and behavioral reconstruction, created a pathway to justice that had previously been unattainable. These advances transformed the investigation from a cold file into an actionable case, paving the way for the identification and eventual prosecution of the perpetrator. Once modern forensic breakthroughs confirmed the presence of a perpetrator's DNA at the scene of Patricia, Annie, Ross's murder, the focus of the investigation shifted to identifying who that individual could be. This stage required meticulous integration of historical evidence, forensic data, and investigative databases, bridging a gap of over 4 decades between the original crime and contemporary investigative capabilities. The first step involved querying state and national DNA databases. Law enforcement had long recognized that cold case resolution depended not only on preserving evidence but also on cross-referencing recovered profiles against those of known offenders. The DNA extracted from Jody's interactions, blood traces, and hair samples produced a comprehensive profile that could be matched with existing records. In this instance, the recovered profile matched Larry Stevens, a man with prior convictions and a documented presence in the La Palma area during the mid-1970s. Detectives reviewed Stevens' criminal history, noting patterns of behavior that aligned with the circumstances of the Ross murder. He had previous charges involving assault and burglary, reflecting a capacity for both physical aggression and intrusion into private spaces. While his prior offenses did not include homicide, investigators considered behavioral tendencies, opportunity, and location as critical factors. The DNA match provided the scientific foundation, but corroborating circumstantial evidence was essential to establishing the broader narrative. Investigators then revisited historical records and interviewed surviving witnesses who had been part of the original investigation. Neighbors recalled unusual activity in the apartment complex around the time of the murder, including the presence of a man fitting Stevens' description in proximity to Annie's unit. While initial reports were inconclusive, these recollections became significant when aligned with forensic evidence. The convergence of memory, documentation, and DNA allowed detectives to reconstruct a timeline placing Stevens near the crime scene during the period in question. One avenue of investigation involved analyzing Stevens' connections to Annie Ross, however tenuous. The original investigation had examined acquaintances, former romantic partners, and casual contacts, but Stevens had not previously emerged as a suspect. His proximity to the crime scene and the timing of his presence suggested opportunity, while his criminal history demonstrated a capacity for violent acts. The combination of opportunity, behavioral profile, and now genetic evidence positioned him as the primary suspect. Behavioral profiling played a critical role in narrowing the field of potential perpetrators. Experts examined patterns of criminal activity, responses to opportunity, and interpersonal behavior. The deliberate yet contained nature of the attack, combined with the effort to confine Jody, suggested a perpetrator with some planning and awareness of potential interference. Stevens' previous offenses provided a behavioral baseline consistent with such an approach. This analytical framework allowed investigators to distinguish between potential suspects with circumstantial links and those whose profiles aligned with the specifics of the Ross case. Investigators also analyzed records of Stevens' whereabouts in 1974. Historical employment documents, residential records, and law enforcement files were cross-referenced to establish his proximity to La Palma at the time of the crime. These records confirmed that Stevens was living within a short distance of Annie Ross' apartment and had the opportunity to commit the crime. Coupled with the DNA evidence preserved by Jody, this proximity created a compelling link that had been impossible to establish during the original investigation. In addition to DNA and location evidence, investigators revisited forensic materials collected from the crime scene. Touch DNA recovered from furniture, the dresser, and other surfaces in Annie's apartment matched the profile derived from Jody's interactions. Each independent sample provided verification, reinforcing the reliability of the DNA match and mitigating concerns about potential contamination or degradation over time. This comprehensive approach was essential for establishing a robust evidentiary foundation suitable for prosecution. Witness statements were also re-examined in light of the suspect identification. Individuals who had reported unusual activity in the apartment complex were interviewed with targeted questions regarding Stevens' presence and behaviors. While the passage of time introduced natural limitations in recall, investigators were able to confirm consistencies with documented movements and interactions. These statements, when combined with DNA and behavioral analysis, strengthened the investigative case and provided context for the reconstructed sequence of events within the apartment. Investigators further explored Stevens' possible motives. While there was no clear evidence of a personal relationship with Annie Ross, his behavioral patterns suggested opportunistic aggression. The selective nature of the crime, personal attack without theft, aligned with the profile of an individual motivated by control or confrontation rather than material gain. Psychological analysis of similar cases indicated that perpetrators in these circumstances often targeted vulnerable victims within accessible residences, a pattern consistent with Stevens' documented movements and behavioral tendencies. Historical law enforcement records were revisited to uncover any overlooked connections. Arrest reports, parole files, and prior case notes provided additional context regarding Stevens' activities, associates, and behavioral history. Although none of these documents alone confirmed his involvement in Annie Ross' murder, they contributed to a broader understanding of his potential capabilities and established a credible backdrop against which the forensic evidence could be interpreted. The identification process also leveraged modern investigative techniques, such as genealogical databases and cross-referencing historical criminal records. These methods, unavailable in 1974, allowed detectives to triangulate Stevens' location, previous associations, and behavioral patterns with precision. The integration of these tools with traditional police work exemplified how contemporary investigation can reinterpret historical cases, transforming dormant files into actionable pathways toward justice. Throughout the identification phase, the unique contribution of Annie's dog remained central. Jody's defensive actions had captured biological traces that preserved the genetic signature of the perpetrator. Without this animal-assisted evidence, the identification of Stevens might have relied solely on circumstantial or incomplete data, potentially leaving the case unresolved. The convergence of canine evidence, preserved crime scene material, and modern DNA analysis created an unprecedented opportunity to finally establish the perpetrator's identity. By correlating all available data, DNA, historical records, witness accounts, and behavioral analysis, investigators were able to construct a coherent profile of the perpetrator. Stevens emerged as the individual whose DNA matched all recovered biological samples, who was geographically and temporally proximate to the crime scene, and whose behavioral tendencies aligned with the attack. Each element reinforced the others, producing a comprehensive evidentiary framework that ultimately allowed law enforcement to move forward with arrest and prosecution. The process of identifying suspects in the Annie Ross case illustrates the evolution of investigative methodology over 40 years. What had been a case constrained by the forensic limitations of the 1970s became resolvable through a combination of preserved evidence, advanced DNA technology, behavioral profiling, and meticulous review of historical documentation. The integration of multiple investigative streams demonstrates how cold cases, once seemingly insurmountable, can yield to persistence, innovation, and interdisciplinary collaboration. The identification of Stevens marked a critical milestone in the long investigation. It validated decades of careful evidence preservation, highlighted the transformative role of forensic science, and underscored the importance of considering unconventional vectors, such as canine-assisted evidence. The breakthrough also reinforced lessons about meticulous documentation, strategic reanalysis of historical evidence, and the synergy between modern techniques and foundational investigative work. In sum, the identification phase of the Annie Ross case exemplifies the modern approach to cold case resolution. By combining historical records, witness testimony, behavioral analysis, and DNA extracted from both conventional and unconventional sources, investigators successfully pinpointed the perpetrator after nearly 4 decades. The process reflects the intersection of science, law enforcement, and human diligence, demonstrating that even long-dormant cases can be solved when evidence is preserved, re-examined, and interpreted through a contemporary lens. Once Larry Stevens was identified as the suspect in the decades-old murder of Patricia Annie Ross, law enforcement and prosecutors faced the delicate task of translating forensic breakthroughs into admissible courtroom evidence. The identification relied heavily on DNA recovered from a combination of the preserved crime scene, surfaces within Annie's apartment, and most notably, her dog Jody. Converting this scientific evidence into a legally persuasive narrative required meticulous attention to procedure, chain of custody documentation, and corroboration with historical records. The first step involved compiling the forensic evidence into a coherent dossier for prosecution. This included laboratory reports detailing DNA extraction, amplification, and profiling, as well as historical photographs, crime scene sketches, and witness statements. Each piece of evidence was carefully catalogued to ensure that any procedural gaps would not compromise admissibility. Given that much of the material was nearly 40 years old, maintaining continuity of custody and providing a detailed record of storage and handling were essential for validating the integrity of the samples. DNA evidence derived from Jody's defensive actions became central to the case. Prosecutors explained that the dog, confined in a dresser drawer during the attack, had physically interacted with the perpetrator, leaving behind biological material including saliva and skin cells. Laboratory technicians provided detailed testimony on how these samples were carefully collected in 1974 and preserved under conditions that prevented contamination. Analysts then outlined the modern extraction and amplification processes that allowed the recovery of a clear DNA profile from these decades-old traces. Corroboration with evidence from the apartment itself was equally important. Blood stains on furniture, hair samples, and touch DNA recovered from surfaces all matched the profile obtained from Jody. Forensic experts emphasized the independent verification provided by multiple samples, strengthening the argument that the biological material could only have originated from the same individual, the identified suspect, Larry Stevens. The convergence of multiple evidence streams created a compelling scientific narrative linking the perpetrator directly to the crime scene. Historical documentation also played a critical role in court. Photographs taken during the initial investigation were enhanced and presented to demonstrate the state of the apartment following the attack. Sketches of furniture placement, the dog's location, and signs of a struggle helped reconstruct the sequence of events visually. Witness statements from neighbors, though limited in precision due to the passage of time, provided additional context. Together with DNA evidence, this documentation painted a comprehensive picture of the crime for jurors, showing not only that the perpetrator was present but also detailing the sequence of intrusion, struggle, and interaction with Annie Ross and her dog. The prosecution relied on expert testimony to explain the scientific methods used in recovering DNA from decades-old samples. Specialists detailed polymerase chain reaction, PCR, techniques, touch DNA analysis, and mitochondrial DNA profiling, emphasizing the robustness of these methods even with degraded or limited material. The court was presented with clear explanations of how Jody's interactions preserved genetic evidence, and how this biological trace was ultimately linked to Stevens with a high degree of certainty. These technical explanations were carefully framed to be comprehensible to jurors without diminishing the evidentiary weight of the findings. Establishing the chain of custody was another crucial aspect. The defense could have challenged the integrity of decades-old samples, citing potential contamination, degradation, or mishandling. To counter this, law enforcement and forensic experts provided detailed records of how all evidence was collected, stored, and periodically re-examined. Each transfer, storage condition, and analysis step was documented, showing continuity from the original investigation in 1974 through the modern forensic reanalysis. This meticulous documentation was key to ensuring that the DNA evidence would withstand legal scrutiny. Behavioral analysis further reinforced the connection between evidence and the suspect. Experts presented a detailed reconstruction of the attack, based on the distribution of biological material, the placement of furniture, and the dog's defensive behavior. This reconstruction explained how the perpetrator's movements and interactions could have resulted in the transfer of DNA and other trace evidence. By providing a coherent narrative of the sequence of events, investigators and forensic specialists gave jurors a clear understanding of how the crime unfolded and how the evidence logically tied Stevens to the scene. Cross-referencing DNA results with law enforcement databases provided an additional layer of verification. Analysts compared the recovered profile with state and national DNA repositories, confirming the match to Stevens and eliminating potential alternative sources. The combination of DNA verification, crime scene reconstruction, and corroborative historical evidence ensured that the prosecution could present a multidimensional case, relying not solely on a single piece of evidence but on a network of scientific, historical, and circumstantial information. The dog's role as a critical witness also featured prominently in court discussions. Jody's presence and interaction with the perpetrator were framed as an essential component of evidence preservation. Prosecutors highlighted the unusual but pivotal fact that a pet had inadvertently captured the perpetrator's DNA, demonstrating how minor details in the original investigation could yield decisive results decades later. This angle emphasized both the importance of thorough initial crime scene documentation and the innovative application of modern forensic techniques to solve a cold case. Legal strategy also involved explaining the limitations of historical forensic methods while demonstrating the reliability of modern analysis. The prosecution clarified that while the original investigators could not perform DNA analysis in 1974, their meticulous collection and preservation of evidence had created the conditions necessary for a breakthrough. This approach highlighted the interplay between human diligence and scientific innovation, reinforcing the credibility of the evidence and the integrity of the investigative process over time. Prosecutors were careful to contextualize the evidence within the broader circumstances of the crime. The deliberate yet contained nature of the attack, the confinement of the dog, and the distribution of trace evidence illustrated premeditation and interaction with the victim in ways consistent with the profile of the identified suspect. Behavioral experts and forensic analysts worked in tandem to convey the logical flow from crime scene evidence to suspect identification, ensuring that jurors could understand the connection without being overwhelmed by technical detail. Throughout the legal proceedings, defense counsel questioned the reliability of decades-old evidence. Arguments included potential contamination, the degradation of biological material, and the possibility of DNA transfer from secondary contact. Each challenge was met with detailed explanations of storage protocols, laboratory validation, and independent verification from multiple samples. The prosecution demonstrated that the convergence of evidence, from canine-assisted traces, touch DNA, blood samples, and hair, left little room for alternative interpretations, providing a scientifically sound basis for the case. In sum, linking evidence to court in the Annie Ross case required not only the application of advanced forensic science but also careful integration with historical records and courtroom strategy. The DNA recovered from Jody and other preserved materials provided the cornerstone, while photographs, sketches, and witness testimony offered a narrative framework. Behavioral analysis and crime scene reconstruction contextualized the evidence, demonstrating how the perpetrator's actions could produce the observed biological traces. By combining these elements, law enforcement and the prosecution translated decades-old investigative diligence into a legally persuasive case capable of supporting conviction. The culmination of decades of investigative work arrived when law enforcement moved to arrest Larry Stevens, identified through a combination of DNA evidence, crime scene reconstruction, and historical records. Nearly 40 years after Patricia, Annie Ross was murdered in her La Palma apartment, the resolution of this cold case relied on the convergence of modern forensic science and careful archival work. While the evidence alone was compelling, investigators approached the arrest with caution, ensuring that all procedural safeguards were followed to preserve the integrity of the case. preparations for the arrest were meticulous. Officers reviewed Stevens' known locations, patterns of movement, and potential risks associated with apprehension. Because the suspect had not faced murder charges previously, law enforcement needed to ensure that the arrest was executed without incident, that Miranda rights were read, and that all evidence linking him to the 1974 crime was fully documented for subsequent legal proceedings. The goal was to take the suspect into custody safely while maintaining the chain of custody for the decades-old forensic materials. When the arrest was carried out, Stevens was taken into custody without resistance. Investigators observed standard procedures, including photographing and logging the suspect, securing personal effects, and arranging for legal counsel. At this stage, detectives were not only focused on securing a confession but also on ensuring that all interactions were legally sound, preserving the admissibility of future statements, and reinforcing the strength of the physical evidence linking him to the crime. During initial questioning, Stevens' reaction to the reopening of the cold case was notable. He expressed surprise at the renewed investigation and at the scientific advances that allowed law enforcement to connect him to the crime after so many years. Investigators approached the interrogation strategically, recognizing that the combination of overwhelming DNA evidence, witness accounts, and the reconstructed sequence of events presented a strong case, but that voluntary cooperation would provide additional clarity and corroboration. Over the course of several interviews, Stevens eventually provided a partial confession. He recounted being present in Annie Ross' apartment on the night of the murder, describing actions consistent with the evidence collected from the scene. While the details were limited and selective, the confession aligned closely with forensic findings, including the struggle in the apartment, the location of blood stains, and the defensive actions of the dog, Jody. This alignment between confession and physical evidence reinforced the validity of both, creating a comprehensive narrative of the crime that had remained unresolved for decades. Investigators paid particular attention to the sequence of events described by Stevens. His account confirmed the struggle, his interaction with Annie, and the moments during which the dog had intervened. Analysts compared his statements to the locations of DNA recovered from the apartment and from Jody, noting remarkable consistency. Each point of corroboration strengthened the case, demonstrating that the forensic evidence and the suspect's own account were mutually supportive, despite the long passage of time. The confession also illuminated previously unclear aspects of the case. Stevens described his motives as opportunistic rather than personal, explaining that he entered the apartment intending to steal but encountered resistance. His acknowledgement of the struggle with Jody provided critical context for how the dog preserved biological evidence. This detail, recorded decades earlier yet overlooked for its forensic significance, became central to understanding how investigators had been able to generate a DNA profile from a small, defensive canine companion. For law enforcement, the confession was both a validation of decades of careful investigative work and an opportunity to document the sequence of events in the suspect's own words. Officers and prosecutors meticulously recorded and transcribed the interviews, ensuring that every statement was legally admissible and consistent with established protocols. This documentation created a comprehensive evidentiary record, linking the suspect directly to the crime while preserving the integrity of the procedural process. The arrest and confession also highlighted the interplay between modern science and human investigation. While DNA evidence had identified Stevens as the perpetrator, the confession added narrative clarity, explaining why traces were located where they were and providing insight into the dynamics of the struggle. This dual approach, combining scientific certainty with personal admission, illustrated the power of integrating multiple investigative streams, particularly in cases where the original crime occurred decades earlier. Media attention around the arrest reflected public interest in cold cases solved through modern forensic techniques. News outlets highlighted the unusual role of Jody, Annie Ross' dog, emphasizing how a small canine had preserved evidence that ultimately led to the identification and arrest of the perpetrator. Coverage of the arrest underscored the intersection of persistence, science, and innovative investigative thinking, demonstrating how long-dormant cases can be resolved when careful evidence preservation meets contemporary forensic capabilities. Legal teams prepared extensively for potential trial proceedings, aware that the confession, combined with forensic evidence, would be central to prosecution strategy. The integration of DNA analysis, touch DNA, hair samples, and canine-assisted evidence created a multifaceted body of proof, allowing prosecutors to construct a narrative that could withstand cross-examination and scrutiny. While the confession itself was powerful, corroboration through multiple independent lines of evidence was crucial for a case that spanned decades. Psychological analysis of the confession indicated that Stevens' admission was consistent with his behavioral profile and historical record. Experts noted that he was forthcoming regarding certain details but limited in self-incrimination, a pattern observed in many long-term offenders when confronted with irrefutable scientific evidence. Law enforcement and forensic experts anticipated these nuances, ensuring that follow-up questioning and documentation captured the most relevant elements of his account without compromising legal integrity. The arrest and confession also served as a demonstration of the evolving nature of criminal investigation. Techniques unavailable in 1974, such as mitochondrial DNA analysis, polymerase chain reaction amplification, touch DNA recovery, and digital reconstruction, combined with careful archival preservation, allowed law enforcement to resolve a case that had eluded resolution for decades. The success of this approach reinforced the importance of maintaining evidence, documenting all aspects of a crime scene, and considering unconventional sources of biological material, such as interactions with pets. For investigators, the culmination of the arrest and confession validated every step of the multi-decade process. From the original crime scene documentation, through careful preservation of evidence, to the application of modern forensic techniques, each phase contributed to the eventual identification and accountability of the perpetrator. Jody's role, once considered minor, proved pivotal in bridging a generational gap in forensic capability, demonstrating that even small details can be decisive when leveraged effectively. Ultimately, the arrest and confession marked a turning point in a long and complex investigation. The suspect, identified through DNA recovered from both conventional and unconventional sources, acknowledged his actions in a manner consistent with the physical and forensic evidence. The combination of confession, DNA, historical records, and behavioral analysis provided a comprehensive evidentiary framework, enabling law enforcement and prosecutors to prepare for the next stage, trial and judicial resolution. This milestone exemplified the intersection of science, diligence, and innovation, showing how cold cases can finally yield answers when modern techniques are applied to well-preserved evidence. The resolution of the Patricia, Annie, Ross case marked not only the identification and arrest of Larry Stevens but also a significant milestone in the history of forensic investigation. While decades of persistence and advances in DNA technology were central to solving the case, the pivotal role played by Annie's dog, Jody, illuminated a lesser-known but increasingly recognized dimension of criminal investigation: the potential of animals to preserve evidence. The case demonstrated that canine-assisted forensic evidence could be both reliable and transformative, inspiring new approaches in cold case analysis worldwide. Prior to the Ross case, few investigators considered the forensic significance of interactions between animals and perpetrators. Traditional crime scene documentation focused on human behavior, trace evidence, and material objects. Pets present at a scene were typically noted for context or companionship, but were rarely analyzed as evidence carriers. Jody's defensive actions changed that paradigm. Her attempts to protect Annie preserved DNA traces of the attacker in a manner that conventional evidence collection could not replicate, effectively acting as a living repository for biological material that had survived for nearly 4 decades. Following the identification and arrest of Stevens, law enforcement agencies began incorporating lessons learned from the Ross investigation into procedural manuals and training programs. Canine behavior specialists collaborated with forensic scientists to create guidelines for evaluating the presence of animals at crime scenes. Investigators were taught to consider bite marks, scratches, fur, saliva, and other biological traces left by both the victim and the animal. This proactive approach recognized that even small, seemingly insignificant details could provide critical evidence, especially in cases where human witnesses were unavailable or inconclusive. The case also highlighted the importance of meticulous evidence preservation. Laboratory protocols emphasized the necessity of controlled storage conditions, careful documentation, and the maintenance of chain of custody records. Without the foresight of the original investigators in 1974 to retain evidence under conditions that prevented degradation, the DNA extracted from Jody and the apartment may not have been viable. This reinforced the principle that long-term evidence management is essential for eventual cold case resolution, and that even minor details can have decades-long consequences. In the years following the resolution, forensic scientists and law enforcement professionals analyzed the methods used in the Ross case to develop best practices for animal-assisted evidence. Workshops, case studies, and academic publications cited Jody's role as an example of how pets and other animals can inadvertently serve as evidence collectors. This influence extended beyond canine interactions to broader concepts of trace evidence preservation, including how clothing, tools, and environmental materials can inadvertently capture DNA or other biologically significant material during the commission of a crime. The implications for cold case investigations were profound. Investigators realized that revisiting unsolved crimes with modern forensic methods could yield results even decades after the fact, provided that evidence had been carefully preserved. The Ross case served as a template for interdisciplinary collaboration. Crime scene investigators, laboratory scientists, behavioral analysts, and historical researchers worked together to integrate data from disparate sources. The successful identification and apprehension of Stevens demonstrated the potential for resolving long-standing mysteries when traditional investigative diligence is paired with technological innovation. Beyond law enforcement, the legacy of canine forensics influenced public perception and media narratives. The story of a small dog whose defensive actions helped solve a 40-year-old murder captured the imagination of the public and reinforced the importance of pets in daily life. Media coverage emphasized Jody's inadvertent heroism, highlighting the ways in which animals can contribute to human safety and justice. This narrative brought attention to the evolving field of forensic science and inspired broader discussions about the role of non-human witnesses in criminal investigations. Academically, the Ross case became a case study in forensic science curricula, illustrating several key lessons: the preservation and reanalysis of historical evidence, the integration of modern DNA technology with traditional investigative methods, and the innovative consideration of unconventional evidence sources such as animals. Students of criminology and forensic science were presented with the challenges and solutions exemplified by the case, demonstrating how persistence, creativity, and interdisciplinary collaboration can transform the investigative landscape. Law enforcement agencies began applying these principles to other cold cases. Following the Ross case, investigators reviewed archives for evidence involving animals, recognizing that even incidental interactions could yield critical biological material. Forensic protocols were updated to include guidelines for documenting and sampling from animals, and training programs emphasized the importance of examining all potential evidence sources at a scene, including pets, wildlife, or domestic animals present during the commission of a crime. The case also underscored the need for ongoing innovation in forensic technology. The ability to extract DNA from decades-old samples, amplify degraded material, and cross-reference profiles against extensive databases was critical to solving the Ross case. These technological advances, combined with careful scene documentation and preservation, demonstrated that innovation in the laboratory is as crucial as diligence in the field. The lessons learned inspired research into improved techniques for extracting genetic material from non-traditional sources, further expanding the investigative toolkit available to law enforcement. Beyond the technical aspects, the Ross case highlighted broader societal implications of solving cold cases. For families of victims, the identification and apprehension of a perpetrator, even decades later, provided closure and reinforced faith in the justice system. The integration of canine-assisted evidence emphasized that no detail is too small to consider, and that even long-standing mysteries can yield answers when approached with creativity and rigor. This narrative served as both a scientific milestone and a human story, illustrating the enduring impact of meticulous investigation on lives affected by crime. In the legal context, the case set a precedent for how unconventional evidence could be presented in court. Prosecutors successfully demonstrated the reliability and relevance of DNA recovered from an animal, establishing that courts could accept biological material preserved in unique circumstances if proper chain of custody and validation protocols were followed. This outcome influenced subsequent cases where forensic evidence derived from animals, environmental surfaces, or degraded samples was used to support prosecution, providing a roadmap for integrating innovative evidence into the judicial process. Ultimately, the legacy of canine forensics extends beyond the resolution of a single case. The methods, insights, and protocols developed through the Ross investigation have informed a broader understanding of the potential roles animals can play in criminal investigations. They have demonstrated that forensic science is not static but adaptive, capable of integrating unconventional evidence, historical documentation, and modern technological advances to achieve justice. The story of Jody, the small dog who inadvertently preserved a perpetrator's DNA, continues to inspire law enforcement professionals, forensic scientists, and the public alike, underscoring the principle that even the smallest details can carry immense weight in the pursuit of truth. The Annie Ross case remains a touchstone in discussions of cold case resolution, innovative forensic methods, and the integration of animal behavior into investigative strategy. It exemplifies the power of interdisciplinary collaboration, the importance of long-term evidence preservation, and the transformative impact of scientific progress on the criminal justice system. Canine forensics, as popularized by this case, has influenced subsequent investigations worldwide, highlighting a novel dimension of evidence analysis that had previously gone unrecognized. In the end, the legacy of the Ross case and Jody's role serves as a testament to the enduring value of persistence, innovation, and attention to detail in criminal investigations. By combining scientific ingenuity with careful documentation, law enforcement transformed a nearly forgotten murder into a solvable case, reshaping the boundaries of forensic science and establishing a precedent for how animals can, inadvertently yet decisively, help deliver justice.